Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Doug Anderson, Dean of the Huntsman School of Business, and we're delighted to welcome you here today to Utah State University, students, faculty, members of the administration, friends from around the valley and around the state. We're delighted to have all of you come and join us today. We are in celebrating the George S. Eccles Memorial Lecture. We are in a long tradition of bringing top experts from the fields of banking, finance, and economics here to Utah State University. And we are thrilled today to gather to hear Dr. Jon B. Taylor of Stanford University. Welcome, Dr. Taylor. Following my brief remarks, Dr. Taylor will be formally introduced by Professor Frank Caliendo, who is Department Head of Economics and Finance and the Academic Director of the Center for Growth and Opportunity. For many years, it's been our great pleasure and honor to host the George S. Eccles Memorial Lecture Series here at Utah State University. This series was made possible by the generosity of the George S. and Dolores Dory Eccles Foundation. George Eccles, a Logan native and alumnus of Utah State University, noted philanthropist and esteemed banker and businessman, sought to bring world-renowned experts in the fields of banking, finance, or economics to this campus. His vision was to create a tradition that would engage students while elevating the intellectual discussion on this campus and in this community on issues of finance and economics. Subsequently, the first ever Eccles Lecture was held in 1974, 45 years ago, when Paul McCracken, the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Richard Nixon, was an invited guest on this campus to speak to that in that lecture series. Since that time, the series has hosted some of the most remarkable guests ever to have visited Utah State University, including such luminaries as Milton Friedman, Herb Stein, Walter Heller, Peter Drucker, Alan Greenspan, Vernon Smith, and our own Lars Hansen, among others. I believe George Eccles would be pleased with what this series has been able to accomplish. I want to also recognize the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University, our partners and friends, for their willingness to co-sponsor and help organize this event. As I reflect on the tremendous history of the George S. Eccles Memorial Lecture Series, I'm pleased today to have Dr. Taylor add to this illustrious legacy, and I look forward to carrying on this lecture series in the future, thanks to the benefactors, our benefactors, George and Dolores Dory Eccles. The intention is to spread economic literacy, to enlighten our community regarding the liberating powers of education, free trade, and business. And today, I'm sure we will continue in that great tradition. With that, I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Caliendo.
Thank you, Dean Anderson. Today, we are so pleased to hear from Jon B. Taylor, the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford University, and the George P. Shultz Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution. Professor Taylor's fields of expertise are macroeconomics, monetary economics, and international economics. He is known for his research on the foundations of modern monetary theory and policy, which has been applied by central banks all over the world and by market analysts around the globe. He has an active interest in public policy as well. He has served on the Council of Economic Advisors to multiple U.S. presidents and as a member of the Congressional Budget Office's panel of economic advisors. Professor Taylor has received numerous awards throughout his career, including the Alexander Hamilton Award for his overall leadership at the U.S. Treasury and the Treasury Distinguished Service Award for designing and implementing currency reforms in Iraq. And he's received the Medal of the Republic of Uruguay for his work in resolving the 2002 financial crisis. And through all his scholarly achievements, he has won award after award for his undergraduate teaching at Stanford University. It's our great honor to have with us today Professor Jon Taylor.
Thank you, Frank. Appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you, Dean. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's an honor for me to be here to give the Eccles Lecture. I have helped to celebrate all the things that the foundation has done over the years in this valley and the whole state and other places. I know his brother was Mariner Eccles, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve for many years, and it's an institution I've studied carefully for most of my life, so it's very interesting to see that connection as well. And there are other connections. Spencer Eccles, brother, say daughter, whose name is Hope, and she's a niece, of course, and she's married to Randy Quarles, who's now serves as the governor of the Federal Reserve and is a good friend. And their son, Randy and Hope's son, Randy, is a student at Stanford and just got finished taking my Economics 1 course. So it's a lot of different connections, and I enjoy that. I also am honored to be here at the Huntsman School of Business. And I didn't know the founder, but I did know his son. I do know his son, who's ambassador to Russia. We worked together in Bush administration for a while, and got to know him quite well. So he's got a tough job, to say the least. But it's a pleasure to be here for many reasons. I love the state of Utah. The love of my life is from Utah. My wife, she went to East High and Salt Lake, and I love these mountains. Wish I had more time to ski and enjoy them. They're just beautiful, and what a great thing to be able to look at them a bit as I give this lecture today. So the title of what I'd like to talk about is economic policy and the outlook for that, and the economic outlook for the economy as well. I've always been interested in economic policy. That's why I've taken time to work in government several times, I guess 4 different stints in my career, because you learn so much by doing policy. And so I want to reflect on this in this lecture. The starting point for me on this is this picture, which is coming up soon, from The Economist magazine. It was put on The Economist magazine in 2016. It was really during the presidential election. And it has a picture of a jockey trying to drive a turtle to go faster. And the turtle is the American economy. And the theme of this cover, which was the theme of many people at the time, was this is just a slow economy. It's too slow. I don't care how many times you hit it. It's a secular situation, secular stagnation sometimes called, and it's not going anywhere. So I've always been critical of this view, at least in recent years, and wrote otherwise about it. And back in not only 2016, 2015, 2013, back to 2012 at least. And my view is not so much that the American economy is this turtle that won't go anywhere, but rather that it's an eagle. And the problem is this eagle is caged, as you can see in the picture. It's a caged eagle. So if somehow we had a way to open the cage, cut open the cage, the eagle would fly, and we'd see much better growth than would be implied by this turtle. So that's the theme, and the question is whether we've been able to get that or not. This is a picture that shows the world economy. In some sense, this theme is global as well as American. This picture is from 2019. In the current year, it's put together by the International Monetary Fund. And the colors, if you can see them, are to indicate which countries are growing faster than other. The more greenish is faster growing, and the darker is slower growing. The G20 countries, with the exception of China and India, are all growing slowly in this picture. Maybe they're beginning to pick up, but not according to the IMF. And I say slow, that's really almost negative, but close to 0%, 0 to 3%, very slow. And so it's not just the United States that is apparently a turtle here. It's a lot of other countries, Mexico, Canada, Japan, Australia, France, Germany, you name it. However, if you also think back just 10 years ago, it was even worse. And so quickly back and forth from that picture to this picture, you see now all the very dark blue are negative growth rates. So U.S. negative, that was a great recession, but it covered a good fraction of the world. And so it's not that we can do better, it's that we may do worse, and that's a fear, a concern that we always have. To show this a little more in terms of time, over time, of course you had 2009, 2019, that's 10 years. But to see it a little better, I want to show you this chart. It's a time series chart. If you can't see the axis, it goes back to 1980 and to the present. This is also from the International Monetary Fund. It's pretty much consensus types of forecasts. The red line at the top is emerging market countries. The one in the middle is the average of emerging markets and the advanced countries. And the one at the bottom is the advanced countries, the blue line. And you can see the great financial crisis, it all went down, all went negative or nearly negative. Before that, growth was 8%, 5.4%, and 3% for those three groups. Now, what people are forecasting is much less growth. The one at the bottom, that's the US and Canada, France, et cetera, only 1.5%, and that compares to 3%. So it's half as much as before, and it's roughly half as much for the other countries as well. So this is a global issue, and I want to argue that it's not only the US economy is potentially an eagle that can get out of its cage, but the rest of the world is too. To get us started, this is, I think, a very interesting picture that describes what's happened in the last 2 years. So on the horizontal axis is 2 years, 2017 and 2018. And the Roman numerals are the quarters for each year. So it's 2017, 4 quarters, 2018, 4 quarters. It goes up to the most recent data we have. And the data we're looking at is the growth rate of real GDP, the measure of goods and services produced in the United States at this time in each quarter, and adjusted for inflation. That's why it's called real GDP. I've looked at the growth rate over 4 quarters. So each point in that picture is the growth rate over the previous 4 quarters. It smooths out the ups and downs in a way that makes sense. So as you look at this picture, I think you see something quite striking, at least I hope you do. So what has happened with growth, by this measure at least, in the last 8 quarters, is it's gone from roughly 1.8, 1.9% to roughly 3.1%. And it's actually quite amazingly, maybe it was a coincidence, got up each quarter the same amount. That's unusual. Usually we have a little bit up and down. But it shows that something has changed. I want to argue to some extent, this is what I said could happen. This is what I said about cutting the cage open. That's the theme, that's the idea, that's the view that I want to get across. That this is not a coincidence, but in fact, may be related to changes in policy that we've seen. So that's the hypothesis that I want to get over. Now, how do we think about growth like this? As economists, we think about, it's a stimulus to the economy. It's a sugar high, it's sometimes called, extra stimulus. Or it could be more supply side things. People are more productive, people are working harder, people have better technology. So there's kind of a demand and a supply side aspect to this. Because we're in an economy right now which is close to full employment, actually unemployment lower than 4%, we seem to be moving along. The real explanations for this have to be more from the supply side. It really has to do with productivity growth and growth of employment, not so much the sugar high aspects. So let's look at the supply slide a little bit. And to do that, I want to introduce the concept of productivity and growth of employment. So this is a table that comes from the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, and it's giving an estimate of growth over, say, a decade per year, 10 years, and the red is CBO. And over on the far right-hand side of the equation, it says 1.8% for real GDP growth. That's the projection of the CBO, roughly 2%. Below that is the reform. That's the cutting the cage open aspect. I put that in green, and the growth rate is 3%. And so 1.8 to 3, that's not too much different than my chart. So the question is there anything to the policy that may have led to this picture? Well, from a supply side perspective, we like to think of the growth of the economy as based on two factors. One, how productive workers are and how much that productivity is growing over time. That's productivity growth. And also how many more people are working. That's employment. So what the CBO has done, and what I'm doing, is divide the total growth rate of real GDP into these two components. So CBO has 1.3 plus 0.5, 1.8. Okay, so that's their estimates. I say, if we did the policy right, we get 2, 1.0, and 3.0. So really what we want to think about here is to what extent that is possible, whether it has happened, whether it's going to continue to happen, et cetera. Now, I want to show you some data. This is still something economists are thinking about. I want to show you some data that shows both productivity growth and employment growth have increased. Actually, employment growth has increased a little more than this statement, and productivity has increased a little less than this statement. But nonetheless, as you see from the picture, we're already close to 3%. And so, first of all, on employment growth, if you look at the data, the most recently released data, you've seen in the last half a year, a little longer, a substantial increase in what's called labor force participation, the fraction of the population that is working or looking for work, labor force participation. And so that's increased. And the CBO forecast is that would decrease. So not only has it stayed steady, which is good, but it has increased. And that's why the employment growth is in fact a little over 1%, way up from the 0.5% of the Congressional Budget Office. So that's what's in the data. You also can see productivity, and I want to spend a few minutes on productivity. It's a little harder to bring into the discussion. And here's a picture to help you do that. It's one of my favorite pictures. This is a picture of productivity growth in the United States going back to the 50s and 60s. And that's the blue line. It's a growth rate of productivity over a year or so on average. So you can see there's ups and downs. I put in the yellow lines to help you see it, and the ups and downs are pretty substantial. We had decline in productivity in the 60s and 70s, increase in productivity in the 80s and 90s, and decline in productivity in much of this century. The picture is drawn up until the last couple of years. What we had hoped would happen with a change in policy, if we got it, I'll talk about that in a minute, is that this would change like that. In which case we get closer to these higher growth rates of productivity, which we need to have a faster growing economy, which I think is important. And so that's the hope that we would get. Now it's just beginning. We don't have a lot of observations, and of course this is a series which bounces around a lot, so we don't really know what it's going to do. Nonetheless, there are some data that shows that productivity is even beginning to increase. And so this is my picture of that. Productivity is, again, the blue line. And now you have to look carefully. I'm not saying this is the last word, but you can see a fairly substantial increase in productivity by this measure going up at the bottom. And I drew in a dotted line, sometimes called a Hodrick-Prescott trend, to smooth those out. And you can see that's increasing too. So it's not increasing as much as the going from the red to the green, but it's going in the right direction. And the sum of those together, sum of productivity growth and employment growth, is in a sense the explanation for the growth or increasing from roughly 2% to roughly 3%. So that's the deal. That's what I think is in the data, in the most recent data that we have. Now the question is, what's the policy that's related to this idea? And to better understand that, you have to look carefully at these things which seem like high-frequency wiggles in the data. So that's what this picture does. These are all real data collected by the Bureau of Economic Analysis or the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is productivity growth from 1 quarter ago. So it corresponds to the real GDP growth numbers I gave you. It shows the 2016, 17, and 18, the most recent data we have. And you can see, hey, there is a fairly substantial increase in productivity, growth, from quarter to quarter, from year to year. And it's going up towards this 2%. It's not there yet. It's hard to measure productivity, but it's going in the right direction. So has something happened in 2017 and 2018 that could possibly explain this, both the employment growth increase, the productivity growth increase, and therefore the growth rate increase? And that's the question. We're right in the middle of it, so we don't know for sure, but I'm going to argue there is a relationship. So to do that, I'm going to talk about policy. And I'm going to talk about policy in some buckets. I love all kinds of economic policy. I love monetary policy more than anything, but I'm going to talk about all the buckets, if I might. So the buckets will be tax reform, regulatory reform, and in regulatory reform, I want to talk about international, very important. I'm going to talk monetary reform, and in case of monetary reform, I also want to talk about international monetary reform. And finally, I want to talk about budget reform to the extent that we have had any at all. And I think many of these will go in the direction that I've indicated we seem to be going, hope we continue. So tax reform. So there was a substantial revision of our tax laws in December 2017. It's been over a year since this happened. But this tax reform, as you know, I think reduced rates on corporations from 35 to 21%. It allowed expensing for a while of investment. It allowed a lower tax rate on small businesses. It also allowed for a territorial tax system for earnings abroad. It also, in all these four dimensions that I've listed here, would reduce the cost of investing, reduce the cost of capital. And why is that important? Because by almost all economic theories, productivity depends on the capital that workers have to work with, the firms, and the technology that goes along with that capital. So as a basic idea, it goes back many years, if there's more capital, more investment in the economy, there will be more productivity. So this goes in the direction, at least the direction, that I indicated is very important. All of these reduce the cost of capital. Obviously, expensing of capital does. Reducing the tax on corporations does. And therefore, it should raise investment, productivity, wages, and economic growth. Now, of course, there's other parts of this tax reform. The personal side is some simplification, lower rates, and deductibility of state and local taxes has been changed substantially. It's hurt states like mine, California, quite a bit relative to other things. But it's more the business side that I'm focusing on now. And that goes in the direction of higher productivity growth. So it's in the right direction in terms of the theory and the ideas and the data that I've indicated. What else has happened? The second on my list is regulatory reform. Probably the most difficult issue to discuss and explain, write about. So there's been quite a bit going on in regulatory reform in Washington. Again, a lot of it has begun in the current administration, using executive orders by the president, using the Congressional Review Act to roll back regulations. I think probably one of the most important things are some of the appointments that have been made. There are different types of appointments, no question about it, different types of people. And I've listed a few here, Ajit Pai at the FCC, Jay Clayton at the SEC, Naomi Rao, she's no longer at OMB, but she was the Office of Regulatory Affairs. Randy Quarles, who I mentioned, is now at the Fed. He's in charge of the supervision and regulation at the Fed. And Mick Mulvaney was, until recently, the director of the Office of Management and Budget and had to do with a lot of regulatory activity. So there are others I could mention, but I think in all these cases, this is not rocket science. But in all these cases, you'll see more of a concern about the costs and benefits of regulation, concerns that the cost might be too high. Of course, there are benefits. Of course, we need to have regulation. But to some extent, the attitude of all these people has been to focus at least as much on the cost as before. So I think maybe that's one of the most important things. They're running the institutions on a day-to-day basis. Other things have happened. There's been some legislation passed. I'll mention one in the area that I'm interested in is financial markets, Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. What that's done is lifted the threshold on regulation of too big to fail firms so that their assessment is done only to the larger firms, the so-called stress tests. So that's also some examples of legislation. I mentioned one thing which has not happened. I probably listed it because I wish it happened. There was a proposal to reform the bankruptcy code so that you'd get away from the bailout of large firms. The proposal is sometimes called Chapter 14 because there is no Chapter 14 in the current bankruptcy code. So we thought that would be a good name. I say we because, again, we worked on it at the Hoover Institution where I'm a senior fellow. And it looked like it was going to pass the House and the Senate. In fact, it passed the House committee unanimously, huge amounts of support in the whole House, and somehow got watered down, didn't get through the Senate at some point. It's really a low-hanging fruit, and I think it would improve the regulatory system to get away from the too-big-to-fail model or threat that their government could go in and rescue a firm that maybe didn't need it so much, and this would be an alternative. It would be a bankruptcy. I know bankruptcies sound terrible, but this would be a bankruptcy that could be quite smooth, could be done over a weekend, and could indeed help the whole financial sector that was affected by the possibility of a failed financial firm. So anyway, in summary, the regulatory reform stuff seems reasonable to me as I look at it, and in the direction of the higher growth. Now, the next question, which is more difficult, is trade. So there's been lots of discussion about trade. There's a new NAFTA called USMCA. It hasn't passed yet, but it's negotiated. There's questions of President Trump meeting with Juncker at the European Union and coming up with some ideas. Lots of discussion about China. And so this is not finished, but let me just say that there's some things which are promising. I think the new North American Free Trade Agreement, USMCA, is promising. It's really, they got together again, US, Canada, and Mexico, have some reasonable rules and agreements that allow for trade again. It's not perfect, but it's really not chaos either. It's an agreement which I don't think many thought we could have. The discussion between the G7 countries, along with Canada, one of the G7 countries, began to raise this idea of 0 for 0, and the same with Trump and Juncker. 0 for 0 means it's like a trade negotiation strategy. We will cut our tariffs to 0 if you cut your tariffs to 0, 0 for 0. It's a beautiful idea. In some sense, that's always been part of trade negotiations. Not the 0 part, but we'll reduce ours if you reduce yours. It's why we've been successful in moving towards free trade over time. So that issue has begun to be discussed. It's not there yet, but it's a negotiating approach, negotiating strategy, and maybe something will come of that. The issue which is not solved at all at this point is the issue of China. And here, I think what has to happen, there has to be something more specific about what the goal is, what China will do. We've learned a lot about what China's trade policies are in the last couple of years. There's no agreement about them, say, reducing their tariffs. There's no agreement about them affecting the foreign ownership regulations, but it looks like there may be, in which case I think there's a sense in which there would be some real progress. And that would be in the direction of removing barriers to trade. That would be in the direction of things that would improve the economy. We don't know where that will be at this point, but I'll just mention one thing which I think is illustrative of the sense in which the dialogue has changed. So when President Trump announced the steel and aluminum tariffs, and of course I'm going to characterize that as a negotiation tactic, that's a way to get China to reduce its barriers. We hope that that's what happens. But as he announced that, he revealed something I don't think many people know. He read a tweet from Elon Musk. He produces cars out there where I live. And the tweet said, Mr. President, when I export a Tesla to China, I pay a 25% tariff. When a Chinese car comes in America, it's 2.5, 25 and 2.5. That doesn't seem right. And so the notion, not so much is that we have been able to deal with that, because we haven't yet, but the fact that more people are aware of that asymmetry. And the hope is that we can get further along those lines. At least that's my hope. There are some other things which I think we're not quite there yet, but would be helpful. I say emphasize the value of open markets and rules-based policy in other international areas, what I call it. So here, the idea is that the global economy is affected by many regulations and many barriers to capital, many barriers to trade. But trade is just one of them. There are a lot of barriers to the flow of capital. And so if there could be a statement or a stance that there be more availability or opportunity to invest abroad on capital as well as goods, that would be more conducive to an open trading system globally. So I was on a committee, I'll come back to this in a minute, G20, so-called Eminent Persons Group. It's an embarrassing name, I know, but that was basically to make these kinds of recommendations. And we'll see if they are taking place. I want to come back to it in a minute, but it's just related to the international dimension of regulation. So let me go on. Monetary policy is my third bucket. So here we're talking about it all the time. At least I think we're talking about it all the time. And there's been some very important changes in the last 2017, 2018. And I would say the Fed has begun to get back on track. I'll describe that in a minute. There's lots of indications of that, speeches, et cetera. But there's been some very recent changes too. So I want to sort of talk about in the context of growth. So first of all, skip that. First of all, there's been lots of statements. And statements go back to 2017. So Janet Yellen was the chair of the Fed until Jay Powell took over. And so back in January of 2017, she's saying things like the Fed has a strategy. And this is the first time this has been articulated so much. I have a quote: "When the economy is weak, we encourage spending and investing by pushing short-term interest rates lower. When the economy is threatening to push inflation too high, down the road, we increase interest rates." So that's a strategy. That's a rule, I like to call it a rule, where the interest rate moves up and down in a particular way. Then she compared that strategy with something that's sometimes called the Taylor rule, which is a more specific way to talk about that. So that's to me progress in the sense of making monetary policy, in this case, more rule-like and more strategic. Stanley Fischer was the vice chair of the Fed at that time, gave the same kind of messages. And then in July of 2017, for the first time, this is, I think, pretty important, for the first time ever, there was a whole new section of the Fed's monetary policy report, which was called Monetary Policy Rules and Their Role in the Federal Reserve's Policy Process, which went through this whole thing about the importance of strategies and rules. And I think that's a change. Then you had 2018, a new chair of the Fed began, Jay Powell, and he did lots of the same things. He included this section of the Monetary Policy Report. He testified in Congress in February or March of last year, and I'll just read it. "In evaluating the stance of monetary policy, the FOMC routinely consults monetary policy rules that connect prescriptions for the policy rate with variables associated with our mandated objectives. Personally, I find these rule prescriptions helpful." So again, strategy, rules, et cetera. Ray Kudlow, who was and is director of the National Economic Council, thought this was quite striking. I've never seen any testimony before. I think that's progress. And then there's more on the website. In July of last year, Monetary Policy Report also had these strategic things. And just to update, most recently, they've done the same thing in the most recent ones released this month. So it goes on. Now, this is just an indication about the appointments at the Fed being more in this direction, which I think is important. This is a quote from Richard Clarida, who's the vice chair of the Fed with Jay Powell. And so he's saying economic research suggests that monetary policy should be data dependent, that's rule-like, and indeed central banks around the world, including the Fed, often describe their policies in this way. So, and then they quotes from, I have it because he quoted me, have to put that on the slide. But that's the idea. So there are all these changes which are in the right direction. Now I have some what they call dot plots to look at. Dot plots are hard for me to see, but they're little dots that you can see that represent the changes in policy that is going on at the Fed. So I'll explain this to you quickly. This is from 2013, so it's 5 or 6 years ago. It's a description of where each member of the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, including the board and the presidents like San Francisco and New York, think the interest rate will be, the short-term interest rate. And you can see in 2013, they're basically zero. And they start to increase in 2014, start to increase in 2015. And then most important, they thought that the normal level, the level it would go to eventually is 4%. I've circled the circle is not part of their picture. The 4 is not part of their picture. That's me circling the dots so you can see them. So 4% is where they thought the federal funds rate was going just that years ago. But things have changed. And to some extent, they've changed along the direction I've mentioned, in some senses others. So this is a picture. This is harder to see. I'm sorry. They made the dots harder for all of us to see at the Fed. But this is in March of 2018. And the main thing to point out is, if you quickly, those two back and forths, the 4% has become 3. So they now think that we're going towards 3 rather than 4. It's a big change. And in addition, they've started to raise the interest rate. In 2019, 28, you can see the blue line is how the rate has come up way above 0. It's roughly 2.5%, and going towards 3. And then that's still of March of last year, but March of this year is here. So this is the most recent plot they put out. And you can see, well, there's 3%, maybe even lower than 3%. That's come down. And the guesses of where we'll be this year have also come down. So there's been a change, and lots of people talk about it in the press and at the Fed. They've lowered where they're going. And the real question is why that has happened. Is that a movement away from the strategic rule-like things I think are important? Or has the Fed thought the economy doesn't look as good as it did? Their forecasts for inflation and output are different. And we're still working on it. We don't know exactly. They haven't done anything yet. This is still a projection of what they'll do. But I think from the point of view of interpreting whether this change in policy that I think is so important for the change in growth, again, the normalization of policy is beneficial for growth. That needs to continue if we're going to get the improvement in growth. So this is still uncertain, and I can't say with the same degree of conviction I would have said a couple months ago that this has changed. Okay, I hope that's clear. This is just one picture to show you why this is such an important issue. This is so-called yield curve, which I've noticed the yield curve has, in terms of searches on Google, has reached a peak in trending for some reason. Everybody's looking at the yield curve, so we've got to talk about the yield curve. This is the interest rate on Treasury securities. Goes out all the way from 1 month to 30 years. And I've plotted this in 2013, 2018, and as of last Friday, 2019. And you can see that the 1 month has increased a lot, and that's the normalization of policy. That's close to 1 day, 1 month. And the other side has not increased as much. And most recently, as of last Friday, and it was true yesterday as well, the line has actually inverted. And so there's actually a downward sloping part of that yield curve. And lots of people are talking about that, and they're wondering, does that mean the economy is getting worse? And the rationale would be, oh, the 10-year is now lower than the 1 month. That must mean rates are expected to come down further. That must mean times are going to be bad. But we don't know if that's the case. That's still just conjecture of what's the case. And to some extent, I think it's related to the global issues, which I want to finish up with now. Why is it related to global issues? Well, the world is integrated. It's a global economy. In Europe, the interest rate on longer-term securities is actually negative right now. Not only low, it's negative. And that can tend to pull down longer-term securities. I think it's one of the factors why you're seeing the curve coming down, and maybe slightly inverted for certain securities. But we don't know yet, but this is an issue related to the monetary policy decisions. Okay. The interesting thing about all this globally, and over time I've become more and more interested in the global situation, is that it has global implications for monetary policy. And so the idea, and that's what this slide tries to get into, is the Fed itself normalizing policy. Interest rate coming off of 0, more rules-based policy, appointments to the Fed, all those things are part of normalization. And the question is, will that make other central banks normalize as well? There's a great deal of relationship, correlation, following of one central bank around the world to others. I have quoted looks like two central bankers. Raghu Rajan, who used to be the governor of the Central Bank of India. What we need are monetary rules. Mario Draghi, who's the president of the European Central Bank now. We would all clearly benefit from improving our communication of our reaction functions, those rules. And recently I've been talking to other central bankers, including the ASEAN countries and Central Asia, et cetera. And so there's a sense in which there needs to be some monetary reform globally. And to the extent that the Fed is leading this by normalizing will help. What I think is attractive about thinking about this globally, and maybe we can get into this in the question and answer period, which is coming up, is that each country can still choose its own strategy. This is not coordination in the sense the Fed and the ECB do the same thing by any means. It's a question that each central bank communicates about what it's doing, its strategy, the things that Yellen and Powell and others discussed. And if that's the case, I think the world economy will work better. So let me just try to finish up, take some questions. This is a picture of the global economy. Hope it's visible. It's produced by the Bank for International Settlements, which is the bank for central banks. And what they've shown is how global this situation has become. And they did that using the so-called Taylor rule, which is, again, as I indicated, is a way to connect the interest rate decisions of central banks to their inflation and output observations. And so what they've done here is they've compared the actual policy rate of the countries around the world. Global is all the countries. Emerging market is just the emerging market countries. And you can see that beginning in 2003, 4, and 5, they began to deviate. They became exactly right on in the recession, which was good, and then began to deviate again. So for some reason, there's a relationship between the decisions made about these central banks. And I know what it is. I talked to them. They basically are concerned about the exchange rate. And so if the U.S. has a very low interest rate, other countries say, we need a low interest rate too, otherwise our exchange rate will be very strong. That's bad for our exports. And so they'll choose a lower interest rate as well. So there's this connection. That's why it's so important to think about this normalization globally and to have recommendations that are along those lines, or global. And that's what we tried to do in this so-called eminent persons group, which I'll just say we did. It's in the slides later. Skip over that. Okay. And then finally, my last bucket, which is the budget. And here, if I've sounded enthusiastic, I certainly about the tax reform and the regulatory reform, trade and monetary, I'm less enthusiastic. Here I think there's a bit of an issue, there's a problem. I've illustrated this with a picture which has not only the situation before the tax reform of December 2017, but also after. It's showing you the debt as a fraction of GDP and interest payments as a fraction of GDP. The debt as a fraction of GDP is over on the right. The interest payments as a fraction of GDP are on the left. And you can see everything's increasing. The debt is exploding with our current policy in place. The debt got a little worse in the tax cut, but it's getting better even with the tax cut, but it's still very bad. It's mainly a spending issue. And then finally, interest payments on the debt. As the debt grows, the interest payments on the debt grow, and therefore we have to spend more on interest payments. So it's a possibility of a spiral, which is of concern. So this is something which I still think needs work. I've actually written op-eds about this with some of my colleagues. Never been criticized so much for saying we need to deal about the debt. It's becoming more okay to have a big debt, okay to have a big deficit. So we've not addressed this problem yet. And of the four buckets is the one that concerns me. But let me conclude by saying that overall, I think what I've tried to say in these remarks is that there's been a change in policy, and some of those buckets are much better than we had before. I can argue that's one of the reasons we've had better growth. I'm never going to prove anything for sure in economics, but it also goes in the right direction. It's not perfect. There's things to do, and the thing that I would stress the most as an economist, as someone been involved in policy, is to try to deal with the debt and the deficit going down the road. So thank you. I'll take any questions that you may have.
So if the yield curve inversion persists, how do you think the Federal Reserve should respond to that, and what implication would that have for the rest of the economy?
Respond to what exactly?
So if the yield curve inversion persists,
Okay.
how should the Federal Reserve respond, and how would that impact the rest of the economy?
So I don't think they should explicitly respond to the yield curve. They should understand why it is inverted. So I think, to me, it's naturally in flattening, because as they raise the short-term rate, the long-term rate doesn't change as much. So there's a natural flattening. That's to be expected. The inversion is a issue because historically, inverted yield curves have sometimes occurred at a time or preceding recessions. And so often that's the case is because the Fed has been trying to fight inflation, so they've raised rates to try to fight inflation, and a byproduct of that has been recession. That seems to me different in the current circumstance. And it's not only because inflation circumstance is much different, but also globally. I did mention you have negative interest rates in Germany. And it's not like investors look only at the Cash Valley. They look at the whole state, they look at the whole country, look at the whole world. And so there's a relationship between those two. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think now we should be thinking more, at least those of us in civil society, about the global aspects of this. Because we do have, it's a very unusual monetary policy around the world. Negative interest rates in Europe, negative interest rates in Japan. Japanese are pegging the 10-year rate. There's a huge expansion of the balance sheets I haven't talked about. So getting that back to normal, I think, is important too. And that's one of the reasons why I think that deviation from normality is one of the reasons for the curve. It's not necessarily a harbinger of a bad time. There's other things to look at, which people are worrying about, which is good to worry about. But I think the economy looks pretty good at this point, and I don't see a reason to think of this yield curve as a big factor. So therefore, the Fed should not think of that on its own, as the only thing.
Hi, I'm Megan Hansen. I work here at the Center for Growth and Opportunity on our research team. Thank you so much for your remarks. One of the issues that we're committed to studying is the impact of immigration and immigration policy on the U.S. economy. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the impact of immigration policy broadly and also current immigration policy discussions that are going on now.
So I don't think it has too much to do with the shorter term things I said. I think it's important to have a good immigration policy that people understand, and it's part of the rule of law. I think it's very important. I think we're trying to resolve some issues now which should be resolved, but immigration is important for our country. It always has been important for our country. So I'd like that to continue in a sensible way. I do want to be sure, I don't really think of that as a reason why monetary policy should change. Or fiscal policy. It does cause some uncertainty. I mean, there's lots of uncertainty in politics at this point. It goes ups and down, and some economists say that uncertainty is a drag on the economy, and immigration is one of the uncertainties. How that's going to affect individual lives, what will do that politics, et cetera. And so I think it's an important issue. I don't know, it seems to me there's many other issues that I've not mentioned which are important. One of the ones I'm most concerned about related to immigration is education. I have some data which makes it look like we need to do a lot more work, especially on K-12 education. Maybe that's some of the things you're working at. It's more to make sure that income distribution is not so skewed. In California, I was mentioning today, California has the highest poverty rate in America. One of the richest states, the highest poverty rate. So that doesn't seem acceptable to me. So we should be finding ways to deal with that. It's a border state, just like Texas is a border state. Situation is quite different. And maybe that's related to immigration. I don't think so, but it's more related to education.
Can we solve our debt problem by just printing money and then controlling inflation with taxes?
No.
Why not?
Well, printing would be, you saw my chart, printing money would be so much money, it would definitely cause inflation. History shows that, different countries show that. And that's very destructive. We had inflation in the 70s and bad economic times, so it would be a terrible way to move. You mentioned tax increases.
To control inflation, just taxes.
Oh, use taxes. Well,
I'm just asking about.
yeah, I don't think taxes by themselves, it's really, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Milton Friedman was mentioned earlier today as giving one of these talks. I think that's what we were colleagues for many years. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. And if you print a lot of money, you'll have high inflation. I carry around in my wallet, I don't know if I'll be able to show this very well, but I'll try, a Zimbabwe note. And the Zimbabwe note is for, wherever it is, here it is. It's for, oops, that's the pound. Oops, that's the Iraq dinar. I carry everything around. Oh my gosh, where is this? Yeah, here's some Zimbabwe dollars. $100 trillion note. $100 trillion note. So that's what can happen if you ignore monetary policy. So I don't think the tax policy will deal with that. I think the question is, why is the budget deficit so big? Why is it growing? Why is the debt growing? And for the most part, it's spending. I don't know. You can say, oh, it couldn't be spending, we raise taxes. But taxes are not the reason for this explosion. Taxes are sort of like this, spending is sort of like that. And so we need to come to grips with that. I think that a lot of the spending is so-called entitlements, but there's a lot of reforms, sensible reforms that will make people's lives better if we fix those. So that's what I would do, and you can see why it's difficult politically to do that. And unfortunately, we have not done much of it yet, but money growth would not be the answer.
So if I'm not mistaken, prior to the last recession, like interest rates were over 5%, and then so the Fed cut it all the way down to 0 and then had to do all this quantitative easing. With rates only at a little over 2, if there is a recession at some point, do you see another round of quantitative easing and all that as being likely? And is that the new normal? And if so, is that fine or is that problematic in your view?
So I think it's problematic. I've done a fair amount of research on the impact of quantitative easing. I don't think it's helped much. We've had slow growth during the whole period of quantitative easing. Some people say, usually a lot of people, the Fed say it worked. I don't think it had much effect. So I don't think it's a good instrument to use. I think the Fed, at this point with interest rates only around 2.5, if they cut it for 5, they'll run into the zero bound again. So they may indeed go that route. They're thinking about it. I would rather, that's one of the reasons why I think normalization is important. I'd rather get to a situation where the interest rate is more normal, and so you could have ups and downs. It doesn't have to be 5, it could be 2, it could be 3, it could be 1, but it's more of a normal rate. And not only is that good for stabilizing the economy, it's good for financial markets. Markets work better if the interest rate is market determined. It's been worked in that way in the past. Not having it that way is contagious to other countries. So it's part of my thinking it would be better if we had a balance sheet, so to speak, which is more normal, interest rate more market determined, and that's what normalization would be about. To be sure, the Fed is not there yet. They've started a lot of normalization. I think they could go a little further before they're done. And the issue of the balance sheet, they've been trying to reduce its size, but it's still quite large. And it's not just the Fed. The ECB, DOJ, a lot of other central banks have a large balance sheet. So it'd be better, I think, if we had a more normal monetary policy in that dimension as well.
Thank you, Professor Taylor,
Okay.
for being with us today.
So appreciate it. Okay. Give my minute.
It's a great honor for us to have somebody of Professor Taylor's caliber here in the Huntsman School of Business and at the Center for Growth and Opportunity. We appreciate you for making the trip out here to lovely Cache Valley, and we hope to see you again soon.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Thanks a lot. Okay.